Tonight, I won't lead you into the roar of cannon fire or the glow of royal ceremonies. Instead, we'll slip quietly through a door that was rarely opened, and never loudly dot not to the Sultan's throne room, but to the spaces behind it. Not history written in victories, but in whispers. In the rustle of silk drawn tighter, in the sun of ambergris lingering longer than it should have, in a sigh not meant to echo, but remembered anyway, because not all power in the Ottoman Empire wore a crown. Some wore coal, or jasmine, or silence dot, and tonight we'll walk where the moonlight bends before entering, where secrets had routines, and where desire was both law and transgression dot, so dim the lights. Settle into something soft, and if you feel your breath slowing, that's just history finally exhaling. If stories like this help you rest, feel free to subscribe. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, maybe the next story will find its breath where yours just paused asterisk down this gentle hallway. Oil lamps hang at uneven heights, each globe breathing a sleepy glow against Iznik tiles that resemble endless ponds of cobalt and jade. An attendant, wrapped in damask, the color of cooled pomegranate syrup, glides past, carrying nothing more scandalous than a bronze censer of ambergris. The smoke curls upward, meets the ceiling beams, and settles again like a cat that can't decide which. Cushion is warmest, and here the whispers of the harem walls are so quiet they feel polite, as though gossip has adopted court etiquette. Rumors bow before entering a sentence, and secrets curtsy before they leave. The palace architects designed these corridors with deliberate bends, ensuring no breeze could rush or gossip travel in a straight line. A turn to the left, another to the right, and a breeze becomes too courteous to hurry. Even the moonlight, filtered through carved lattice, seems to pause between steps, broken into neat rectangles that look like polite letter paper laid upon the floor, waiting for ink that never comes. A concubine one of nearly 300, though census numbers in the outer apartments are as slippery as soap in the hammam, adjusts a filigreed hairpin so slowly that an impatient minute might walk away in search of company. Her rank tonight depends not on whispered beauty, but on chessboard politics. The Velvet Sultan, mother of the reigning ruler, sits in an adjoining room with women who nod so unhurriedly that a nod seems half a nap. They discuss emerald bracelets, the price of rosewater from Damascus, and which girl's grandmother once prayed in the same mosque as the judge of Mecca's cousin, every scrap of lineage measured, folded and tucked like perfumed linen. Power travels here in trays of sherbet, peach-colored and studded with pine nuts. Whoever receives the silver cup first might well receive a son 9 months hence and a stipend thereafter, provided her fortunes keep pace with her patience. The eunuchs, keepers of these careful currents, announce messages in voices so soft you could lay your head upon a sentence and use it as a pillow. Somewhere outside, a nightingale repeats a phrase it has probably repeated for centuries, practicing the same note because improvisation is discouraged in palatial gardens. Even the bird submits to protocol far inside, beneath a painted cupola where golden stars blur into one another like candle grease. The Sultan's favorite prepares for a visit. Attendants dust musk over her pulse points, counting precisely 12. Taps because 11 would appear careless, and 13 would tempt envy to wake too early. Her embroidered robe is turquoise at the shoulders, turning seafloor green by the hem, an ombre effect achieved by dipping the cloth into dye vats perched on brass stands that wobble slightly, as if the color itself weighs more in certain decades. While she waits, palace musicians in a room 2 courtyards away coax the kanan, that cedar-frame zither, into sighs so soft a passing moth might mistake them for compliments. A court poet has composed couplets comparing the favorite's eyelids to ferret pelts fashionable for the decade. though future listeners will wonder why anyone thought of ferrets in matters of desire. Behind a mashrebe screen, elderly laundresses are folding linens that once touched the sultan's skin. They murmur over thread counts the way astrologers debate planetary houses, convinced the cosmos hides within cotton. If you're still awake, consider it proof that even astronomy can be boring when reduced to laundry talk. Hours dissolve. Somewhere near the library, a junior scribe copies state letters by oil lamp, the ink drying to the rhythm of palace intrigue. He will never glimpse the favorite's chambers, yet his careful calligraphy indirectly decides how many silk bolts are purchased next season. A butterfly, flapping in a ledger and causing a storm of velvets and bursa. In the favorite's room, a silver mirror tilts forward, reflecting not her face but the ceiling fresco. Winged cherubs imported by Italian artists generations earlier, their Roman noses incongruous among tulip scrolls. The mirror seems to prefer art to reality, a gentle compliment, perhaps, to the one about to enter its gaze. At long last, soft slippers approach. The attendants retreat like petals closing at dusk, and the air grows thick with expectation, salted subtly by anxiety. But the palace protocol insists that anticipation stretch like fresh gum Arabic, pliable, translucent, and ever so slightly sweet. It is an expertly boring tension, brewed to lull rather than thrill. Dawn teases the lattice with the first thread of pearl gray. In an outer courtyard, a fountain persuades nighttime to linger by mimicking rain in a place where clouds rarely oblige. A gardener sprinkles rose petals across the water basin, not for fragrance, but to keep beetles from drowning. Ignominiously small mercies, even for insects, are protocol here. Presently, the muezzin's call unfurls over the Bosporus, its echo caught by cupolas and returned just a shade softer, as though the city itself wishes to keep mourning in hushed tones. Within the harem, lamps are snuffed one by one. Each wick releases a tiny thread of smoke that curls like a final sentence yet to find its verb. The concubines drift back to their rooms, unsure whether night's conversations were opportunity or obligation, but resolved to list them in memory's careful ledger regardless. Mausoleum sparrows begin their fidgety debates about crumbs, and the palace cats, those indifferent understudies to royalty, stretch with the self-assurance of creatures who have never signed a treaty yet preside over every threshold. Somewhere, a eunuch closes the heavy cedar door that separates rumor from record. The bolt slides into place with the faintest clink, quieter than a sigh, louder than a dream. And so the palace resumes its most cherished pastime, waiting politely for another night to settle, another secret to yawn awake, another listener, perhaps you, to drift at last into the gentle abandon of sleep. You might not expect an empire's worth of strategy to hinge on how slowly one man unlaced a velvet bed curtain. Yet here we are, drifting through the imperial bedchamber where diplomacy, desire, and insomnia share the same embroidered pillow. If your eyelids still cling stubbornly to wakefulness as I describe tassels and treaties in the same breath, feel free to subscribe or simply allow your attention to wander down the corridor until it finds a comfortable ottoman of its own. Tonight, the palace sleeps around us, but this single room stays half-lit, its lanterns trimmed to the faintest glow, so every movement seems wrapped in dusk. The walls are paneled with sandalwood, whose scent rises gently under the heat of a brazier. Rumor claims the wood was shipped from distant Ceylon, but the ledgers remain politely silent on the matter, as they do on most pleasures. The ceiling is domed, painted in roses that bloom upside down, their petals frozen mid-flutter like dancers awaiting a cue. At the room's center sits the imperial divan, less a piece of furniture than a diplomatic arena upholstered in crimson brocade. Visitors rare, ranked, and carefully rehearsed approach it with the hush one grants sacred relics, because here silk can overturn alliances and a sigh can resequence the bureaucracy. Thick carpets hush every footfall. yet each not a bear. Weave was itself a calculation. Certain hues, deep indigo, pomegranate, crushed pistachio signify rank. Step upon the wrong color and protocol might stub its toe. Eunuchs, guardians of both virtue and rumor, glide about in soft slippers dyed. The unlikely shade of aging parchment. Their presence is neither fully masculine nor feminine, neither wholly invisible nor boldly declared. They are a living footnote, forever explaining but never starring in the text. Near the divan, a cluster of cushions forms a gentle topography of satin hills where emissaries once mealed, ostensibly to discuss tariffs on Adriatic grain, but truly to measure the Sultan's appetite for loyalty, scented with intrigue. During these audiences, conversation drifted from taxes to perfume, blends with remarkable ease. Which adder do you favor tonight, Majesty? An envoy might murmur, knowing full well that preference for rose over jasmine could hint at fondness for one court faction over another. In response, the Sultan would inhale quietly, leisurely, and allow uncertainty to steep like cardamom in coffee. A diplomatic tactic gentler than steel, but sharper than rumor dot, speaking of scent. The imperial perfumery lies just 2 courtyards away, its entrance hidden behind a lattice of ivory inlay that resembles musical notation. There, distillers simmer amber, musk, and frankincense in copper stills, whose necks curve like crane feathers. Each drop of oil is labeled with calligraphy, as delicate as larkspur stems. The handwriting alone could lull a wakeful mind to drowsy admiration. Servants carry the finished phials through passageways cooled by marble fountains, ensuring the essences arrive here still fresh, ready to braid themselves into the fabric of court life. Tonight the blend is an opulent confusion of sandalwood and black orchid, poured into crystal boats and fanned across cushions until the very air feels upholstered. A visiting poet, invited precisely because poets are excellent at flattering by implication, once wrote that a single breath in the bedchamber was like tasting the first sentence of a complicated novel. Flavors of plot and subtext on the tongue, followed by an after-scent of secrets. Music, too, threads its way into strategy. In an adjoining alcove, 3 musicians coax the oud, ney, and canem into soft conversation. They choose the makam known as haikas, a scale famous for lingering one. Note away from resolution, as though even melody respects the palace habit of never finishing a sentence outright. The kanan strings vibrate so subtly that listeners report a phantom tickle along their ribs, an auditory reminder that pleasure is also a form of governance. To ensure the moment does not accidentally become exciting, the tempo slopes downward. Like warm honey, each pluck invites a yawn. Each flute phrase flutters away before it can hatch into enthusiasm. The court astrologer insists that particular rhythms encourage agreeable dreams in rulers, and agreeable dreams in rulers encourage agreeable edicts come daylight. Whether or not the cosmos concurs, the musicians oblige, repeating phrases until repetition itself melts into ambience, and only a suggestion of sound remains very much like a promise with its edges blurred. Of course, the palace handbook on propriety, not written but universally memorized, allows passion only through the safest conduits. Thus, a favorite concubine may approach the sultan dressed in 7 layers of gauze, each dyed a shade deeper than the previous, an arrangement nicknamed the 7 petitions. The first layer petitions mercy, the second petitions favor, and by the 7th the lady petitions sleep hers, his, and yours, should you be listening. She removes each veil with ceremonious deliberation, pausing between gestures so that palace clocks might grow jealous of her authority over minutes. Courtiers maintain that policy discussions conducted afterward are more persuasive, as if persuasion blooms best in humid air scented with carnations. Meanwhile, beyond these draperies, ministers tally silver shipments and grain quotas, trusting that the empire's fate rests and rests well on cushions stuffed with eiderdown. Yet even the softest empire collects sharp secrets. Forbidden's rendezvous bloom in corners where protocol's lantern light thins to moon haze. A junior scribe might exchange a scented handkerchief with a kitchen, apprentice ginger and parchment entwined in a romance too mundane for epic poetry, yet too improper for daylight. If discovered, punishment could range from exile to the less dramatic but equally effective confiscation of stipends. More perilous still are affairs involving minor princes, those young comets orbiting the throne at uneasy distances. Court gossip tells of one such youth who smuggled notes to a visiting Venetian musician, the messages penned in Latin to thwart eavesdroppers. They were caught not by spies, but by an errant roll of sheet music, whose absent page told guards everything. The aftermath involved the prince's dispatch to a provincial governorship, a punishment so sleepy one wonders whether boredom itself was the intended deterrent. Occasionally, rumor escapes the palace entirely, clinging to the hem of a scullery. Maids cloak as she visits the spice market at dawn. There the secret mingles with anise and sumac, rides home in a merchant's pouch, and surfaces weeks later in a far-off province as a story so embroidered it hardly resembles its threadbare origin. A traveler in Aleppo may overhear that the Sultan's favorite bathes in pearls dissolved in vinegar, a detail entirely untrue yet deliciously slow to digest. Such rumors serve a crucial function. They occupy minds otherwise prone to discontent. Like lullabies sung to grown-ups, they distract without rousing, entertain without exciting dot. By the time the call to dawn prayer arcs over the Bosporus, the bedchamber's drama has cooled to a pleasant murmur. Lantern wicks are pinched out with silver snuffers shaped like tulip buds. Their faint smoke curls toward the painted roses, mingling pigment and perfume in the half-light. The Sultan rises carefully, for grandeur can creak like old wood if moved too quickly, and slips into a robe lined with sable so soft it could be mistaken for silence made tangible. Attendants bow, gathering discarded gauze petals and folding them into cedar chests where dreams are stored like seasonal garments. Musicians set down their instruments, each note left mid-exhale, a musical ellipsis comfortable with never finishing. It's thought. Outside, palace cats weave through colonnades, tails held aloft like punctuation marks, signaling the story can pause here until night returns. If you have drifted away somewhere between the sandalwood and the cat, the palace will not mind. Its corridors are built for lingering footsteps and lingering thoughts, its walls trained to soften echoes into hush. Here, desire has the pace of a bureaucrat and the courtesy of a prayer, slow, measured, and always concluding with a bow toward sleep. Let the empire sort its ledgers and its perfumes without you. Your only duty now is to let eyelids fall, like tassels settling after a breeze, and to dream gently, imperially of nothing at all. You might not think the quiet creak of a cedar wardrobe could summarize an entire society's expectations of love and linen. Yet here we are, easing open the marriage chamber of an ordinary Ottoman household where nothing dramatic ever happens and reassuringly never will. If you manage to remain awake while I enumerate pillow-filling preferences, hemp for frugality, cotton for middling comfort, eiderdown for those who feared nightmares might bruise the soul, feel free to subscribe. If sleep overtakes you sooner, the pillows will understand. Our first slow breath of the room smells faintly of rosewater left over from yesterday's ablutions. The mattress sits on a low wooden platform so that couples meet their dreams only a handspan above the earth, a reminder that passion and gravity negotiate constantly. Against the wall hangs a woven tapestry depicting pomegranates split open, just enough to hint at abundance without the vulgarity of spillage. A polite symbol that fruitfulness is welcome but must never stain the carpet. A marriage contract lies folded in a walnut chest nearby, its clauses stipulating obligations with the patient detail of a grandmother winding yarn. The groom promises bread, shelter, and occasionally a new pair of slippers. The bride retains the right to her mar, a dowry that doubles as fallback funding for long silences. Neither party finds surprise in these lines. Expectations arrive as predictably as call to prayer. Even affection follows schedule, a cautious touch during evening tea, a whispered joke after the lamp is blown out, an earnest apology in the morning when someone realizes they have borrowed too much blanket. Scholars later tally such domestic negotiations as social data, but here, in the unhurried glow of an oil lamp, they resemble nothing more than two people sharing warm air and the soft crackle of settling wood. If we open the shutter just a sliver, and only a sliver, lest the night draft disturb the cat, we hear the distant murmur of Istanbul's coffee houses where propriety loosens its sash after sunset. Hookahs gurgle like contented doves, and fortunes emerge in coffee grounds swirling at the bottom of tiny cups. A storyteller leans forward, voice velveted by thick smoke, and recounts tales of sultans who disguise themselves to wander the streets. Everyone knows the sultans probably stayed in bed, but pretending otherwise adds cinnamon to the narrative. Behind this fragrant chatter lurk quieter establishments, brothels advertising themselves by the strategic squeak of a door hinge or the faint scent of attar of cloves drifting into alleys. Guards know the addresses, judges know the ledgers, but both prefer the comfort of not speaking the facts aloud, like children who insist monsters vanish when you ignore them. Clients arrive with faces shadowed by turbans tilted just so, leaving with faces equally shadowed but by a different tilt of thought. Records of these visits rarely survive except as fines, scribbled in municipal margins, tiny monetary yawns acknowledging that temptation too pays its taxes. Back in the coffee house, gossip ferries between tables faster than any imperial courier. Someone whispers that a silk merchant's wife met a Persian poet behind the spice market, leaving a trail of saffron filaments as incriminating as breadcrumbs. Someone else counters that the merchant himself keeps a young good player on retainer, ostensibly for after-dinner serenades, but truly for after-curfew comfort. The stories accumulate like thick grounds at the bottom of the seize, dark and granular, begging to be appended and read. Yet by dawn, most of these allegations will dissolve in the same hot water that brewed them, because the city has an economy of secrets. Circulate them too quickly, and inflation sets in, making even scandal feel cheap. All this murmur finds its dignified echo in poetry, for when Ottomans wished to confess desire without paying fines or tips, they wrote ghazals. A typical stanza might compare a beloved's mole to the Kaaba, orbiting devotion condensed into a single dark dot, or liken parted lips to an unripe quince, tart yet promising. Modern readers sometimes accuse these metaphors of evasiveness, but that is their point, circles spun wide enough to hide in. Consider the oft-used image of the nightingale and the rose. A bird sings until its breast bleeds against the thorn, supposedly for love of perfume. In truth, the nightingale sings because it lacks better employment. The rose listens, patient and unmoved, because roses specialize in unmoved patience. Together they dramatize yearning while sparing the audience any awkward mention of sweating. Palms or misplaced buttons? Poets understood that if you wish to discuss the body, you must first disassemble it into weather and flora eyes become moons. Hips crescents, shoulders snowfall, and then trust the reader to reassemble everything inside their own imagination. A private indoor hobby requiring no official permit. One particularly sleepy night, a minor bureaucrat named Zamdu Amdillah copied verses until the nib of his reed pen split, blurring ink into a velvety smudge. In that blot, we can still see the unspoken tension between duty and desire. The state demands tidy ledgers, the heart prefers messy calligraphy. Ahmed's Poetry notebooks survived only because his grandchildren mistook them for prayer manuals and slipped them into a trunk of mothballs. Centuries later, a researcher opens the lid, sneezes at the lingering camphor, and discovers metaphors so languid they could double as lullabies. Your laughter is slow rain falling on the clay tiles of my patience, he writes, eroding me into a vessel wide enough to hold you. Scholars debate whether such lines ever reach their intended recipient or simply rocked Ahmed himself to peaceful slumber far from these intimate papers. Fishermen on the Golden Horn untangle their nets while reciting half-remembered couplets to keep time. They do not always grasp the poem's delicate innuendos, yet the cadence lulls them through the monotonous labor of smoothing twine beneath moonlight. When a knot proves stubborn, one man quotes, "Even the rose yields when the nightingale persists," and another responds by loosening the strand, proof that metaphor can lubricate more than romance. So poetry seeps downward from elite salons into streets slick with sardine scales and lamp oil, diffusing taboo until it feels like weather present, pervasive, and rarely blamed on any single source stopped by the hour before dawn. Households across the city share a synchronized fatigue. Married couples settle into the familiar geography of shared mattresses. Political treaty turned topography. In alleyway rooms above coffee houses, illicit pairs part reluctantly, leaving behind the ghost of jasmine smoke kisses. Poets close their inkwells and drape damp pages over chair backs like laundry, trusting the air to dry both paper and impulse. Even gossip must sleep. Tongues grow heavy, and promises to tell you tomorrow drift unfinished into snores. Only the muezzin's voice remains alert, rising like a thin gold thread through indigo. Sky to announce that night has surrendered. If your thoughts have wandered at the same pace and hurried, circular, pleasantly absorbed in the texture of carpets and couplets, let them settle now like the last grains of coffee sinking to silence. A city's secrets can wait. They have waited for centuries and shown no sign of impatience. Close the shutter, hush the cedar wardrobe, and let the faint perfume of rosewater merge with dream. Somewhere inside that twilight of half-sleep, you might hear a nightingale still rehearsing the next verse, but its notes will blur into background hum, softer than a turning page, softer than history itself learning to whisper. You might not expect an ink-smudged marginal note in a 17th century legal commentary, one that merely wonders whether goose-down mattresses encourage laziness to unlock an entire culture's nighttime conscience. Yet here we are, easing into the slow hush of rules, rumors, and reminders whispered whenever an Ottoman lamp was dimmed, just enough to make impropriety invisible but still suspected. If you're still awake by the time we reach the proper juridical fine for buying pomegranates after curfew, feel free to subscribe. If you drift off sooner, no Qadi will object. The Sharia texts themselves settle like quiet elders around a brazier, radiating gentle but unarguable warmth. They discuss intimacy in the same tone they prescribe irrigation rites, measured, methodical, sprinkled with the sort of caveats that lawyers love and lovers forget. A husband may visit his wife by night so long as prayer times are respected. A wife may refuse if illness, fasting, or pure reluctance intervene. Both must ensure the door latch is secure because modesty, like a cat, escapes given half a chance. Commentators parsing these points often appear more concerned with the thickness of separating walls. Would a neighbor's accidental cough invalidate discretion? Then with the act itself. One jurist devotes 3 pages to curtain fabrics, concluding that dense blue wool absorbs sound far better than fashionable silk. Another scolds the faithful for excessive mattress tassels, which she fears inspire vanity mid-embrace. Yet beneath every admonition lies an unspoken confession. Passion is assumed, inevitable, perhaps divinely installed, so that commandments have something to regulate. A parchment folio from Bursa recounts a judge's inspection of household lamps. For excessive brightness after midnight suggested illicit reading or worse, illicit reciting. Light, he claimed, could tempt recalcitrant imaginations. Dusk remained the prophet's dimmer switch for a reason. Residents responded by inserting tinted glass into lanterns, casting amber pools that soothed desire into what they argued was law-abiding sepia. The judge, noting his own fondness for mood lighting, quietly let the matter fade like oil on wick. Thus, jurisprudence became a gentle choreography of stated ideals and practical dimmers, lamp oil colluding with human nature to strike a compromise both sides could not beneath. Even with loopholes lovingly hemstitched, boundaries existed, and someone always managed to trip. Punishments arrived when they did, not with theatrical severity, but with a bureaucratic sigh. Fines tallied, brief imprisonments scheduled between market days, the occasional public admonition delivered by an officer whose mustache quivered from equal parts duty and embarrassment. For adultery, texts prescribe stoning, but records show fines, more common stones being heavy, paperwork lighter. One mudger from Eddern lists repeat offenders by profession. Tanners led by a narrow margin, perhaps because leatherwork invites metaphors that prove too persuasive late at night. Another document details the confiscation of an unsanctioned manuscript titled Garden of Delights, described entirely in fruit analogies. Its author, fined for overripe wit, was instructed to copy the Quran by hand as penance, an elegant punishment that turned bodily vigor into calligraphic precision while saving the state the cost of imprisonment. Taboos could be oddly specific. A baker in Galata was reprimanded for sculpting loaves into vaguely human shapes during Ramadan, their rounded flanks dusted with sesame in a manner likely to mislead imaginations. The baker protested that he merely followed an old Byzantine recipe. The court cautioned him to reserve such nostalgia for Lent. In another case, 2 musicians were summoned for playing the ney flute and frame drum simultaneously in a hammam foyer, thereby combining instruments whose tones, when merged with whetstone acoustics, might rouse sentiments unsuitable to bathing. The musicians nodded solemnly, adjusted their tempo to match the drip of ceiling condensation, and were thereafter considered safe. These rulings read today like gentle comedies, but at the time they mapped an invisible fence around collective comfort, ensuring desire remained a candle, not a wildfire within city walls. Yet secrecy, like perfume, souped through any container. Households developed coded gestures. A sash tied twice around a doorknob signaled a spouse's headache. Thrice suggested an evening lesson with the children. Not less signaled, enter softly. Women meeting in courtyard laundries shared herbal tips, clove for courage, mint for coolness, fenugreek to muffle gossip. Men visiting barbers discuss beard oils said to render a lover's kiss less detectable on the skin, though no oil could hide the small smile that lingered after. Even the architecture colluded. Lattice windows allowed glimpses without clarity, encouraging imaginations to do half the work, a cost-saving measure for the morally thrifty. Poets continued their delicate labor, threading Sharia terms into verse, so demure that a censor reading aloud might nod approvingly while an initiate listening sideways would blush. One anonymous treatise on the garden's irrigation outlines in agricultural metaphors the correct rhythm of conjugal visits. Rain must fall neither too early, soil unready, nor too late, pollen adrift, with thunder accepted but only distant lightning plied. Scholars still debate whether the piece is horticultural advice or the subtlest scandal ever penned. The truth likely pleased both camps. As ambiguity made excellent sleeping medicine, you could interpret a line until your eyelids grew heavy, never reaching a conclusion before dreams claimed jurisdiction. And so the nights progressed, regulated yet restless, scented with situational compliance. Deep in the palace, eunuchs carried silverwick snuffers. extinguishing hallway lamps in a sequence designed to prevent accidental sightings, and modest. Homes, fathers tap shutters thrice to announce their return, giving courting daughters time to retreat from window lattice. On coastal hills, dervishes turned in slow circles, spinning doctrine into dizzy acceptance that divine love might blur the petty edges of earthly rule. Each gesture, whether legalistic or lyrical, contributed to a broader hush, a societal lullaby, promising that longing contained is longing preserved, like fruit in winter syrup. At last we reach the hour when the final lantern gutters. Watch its flame bow inward, a dancer ending her slowest spin before collapsing into smoky ribbon. Streets exhale darkness. From distant minarets, the first call to prayer threads through. Air still warm from stray embrace, reminding all sleepers and those pretending to trade whispers for invocations. The baker's oven crackles, poet's pages cool. Even judges dream of ink flowing obediently into margins. Whatever desires pressed against consciousness a moment ago sink back beneath quilts and certainties, folded away like moth-chewed letters in cedar chests. Should your own thoughts still flit, imagine them feathers drifting across that quiet cityscape, light, directionless, finally settling on the tiled roof of a bathhouse now empty except for echoing drops. There, let them rest. History will keep. Its muted vigil, statutes written and unwritten will wait. The nightingale will rehearse silently beneath its rose, and you may drift, unpunished, into the gentle oblivion that even the sternest law book, in its secret margins, quietly blesses. You might not expect the precise length of a discarded clay pipe stem found half buried beside a goose path in rural Hertfordshire to unlock a century of sleepy statistics, but here we are, gently lifting soot-flecked fragments into the lamplight of your closing eyes. If you're still awake when I reach the 1694 ordinance about pipe stems exceeding the width of a tuppence, feel entirely free to subscribe. Though frankly the stems, the ordinance, and I will keep talking whether or not you're conscious. The first fragment drifts in on a late autumn mist somewhere around 1580. English colonists have not yet kidnapped tobacco from Virginia, so local. Pipe makers copy Dutch models with the dutiful hesitancy of pupils tracing neat letters. Each stem spans about 8 finger widths, roughly 14 centimeters, though no one uses centimeters yet and flares into a bowl scarcely large enough to cradle a single beetle. Monks charged with monitoring hearthside novelties jot notes. In round, drowsy Latin, tubulus e faucis repertus, longitudo et modum modica. The phrase, read aloud, sounds vaguely medicinal, as though pipe fragments might cure lethargy rather than cause it. In truth, the monks are mostly pleased that stems break easily. Shorter pieces mean fewer accusations of idleness during vespers, since a truly lingering smoke requires a long stem to keep embers cool. By 1610, imported leaf has turned London wharves into aromatic clouds, and stems lengthen like ivy in July. Gentlemen measure their pipes against sword hilts, an accidental metaphor no balladeer bothers to tease. A guild in Southwark issues its first measurement ledger, specifying increments in barley corns. One entry soberly records, Master Aldrich produced stems of 49 corns. Increase deemed pleasing, but perhaps boastful. You can almost hear the clerk's quill hesitate, unsure whether to envy or admonish. These ledgers become oddly popular bedtime reading among apprentices. Counting barley corns, it turns out, soothes thoughts the way modern minds scroll endlessly through phone. Settings. Somewhere between the 32nd and 33rd corn, most readers drift off, leaving ink to dry in delicate rings, because fashion cannot resist mathematics. Merchants begin staging length trials along Thames tavern benches. Contestants tap stems against oaken boards softly, so as not to shatter their own pride, while spectators wager small coins on which will prove the most extravagant before bending. Surviving broadsheets detail the 1642 champion, a pipe measuring 62. Barleycorns, tipped with a bowl the size of a shilling, which cracked neatly on its second triumphant tap. The owner, one Ellis Prout, collected enough wagers to publish a pamphlet praising restraint. Irony, even then, made an excellent nightcap. Records thicken like chimney soot over the next decades, and a curious inverse law emerges as stems stretch. Toward improbable elegance, bowls shrink to thimble proportions. A chronicler in Norwich attributes the shift to the aesthetics of elongation, though most smokers simply complain of too little tobacco per light. One pamphlet, equal parts satire and sermon, warns that repeatedly refilling such tiny bowls might tempt a man to slothful conversation. The writer's solution is a return to the modest 14-centimeter stem of old, which no one adopts because novelty always outweighs convenience by precisely 7 barleycorns. An unofficial constant scribes call the Prout deviation. After hour, wagering friend, section ledgers survive from 1675, outlining taxation by stem length. 4d for anything surpassing 3 hand spans. 6d if carved with a mermaid. One entry notes a confiscation, pipe of indecent girth, decorated with unchristian foliage, stem measuring unknown for being broken in disgust. The official who wrote that line likely snapped the pipe himself out of duty or envy. Snap. He did, yet thoughtfully tallied shards into the totals column, because bureaucracy sleeps for no stem. Meanwhile, in Cambridge, scholars conduct breath-cooling experiments, timing how long smoke travels down assorted lengths. Their journals reveal more doodles than data swirls of sleepy rings drifting toward the page corner where daydreams gather. One marginal note asks, "Does the smoke grow wiser in passage?" No answer follows, suggesting either slumber or resignation overcame curiosity. Still, their findings, roughly whispered around college fireplaces, convince undergraduates that a 20-centimeter stem confers intellectual gravitas, leading to a brief vogue of scholar pipes. The fad collapses when proctors notice students measuring stems in chapel pews, a misplacement of both diligence and ashdot. We arrive softly at 1694, when Parliament debates whether latent fire risks justify regulating stem length. The bill's language floats like pipe smoke, itself tentative, meandering, occasionally forming the shape of a clause before slipping apart. One proposed cap sets the legal maximum at the distance from a man's thumb joint to elbow. A span so variable enforcement would require sleeping guards to wake and unfold citizens' arms in the street. Predictably, the bill dies in committee, its last breath recorded in minutes, so drowsy the clerk copied a sentence twice without notice, around. This time, stems mysteriously shorten again. Archaeologists later attribute the shift to improved kill temperatures, allowing thicker clay. But contemporary diarists swear the change follows an unusually damp winter that made long stems droop mid-smoke, splashing embers onto costly rugs. Milliners, seeing opportunity, began stitching sparking cloths to drape across the lap, turning hazard into fashion. One bored house guest writes of an evening where conversation consisted entirely of comparing scorch patterns, floral, shapes considered especially chic. By 1710, we re-encounter the familiar 14-centimeter range. Pipe makers declare the circle complete and issue commemorative stems stamped with barleycorn motifs. Each mark a tiny raised reminder of all the counting mankind performed to end exactly where it began. Discerning collectors prefer stems with misaligned stamps because nothing sues perfectionism like a sanctioned flaw dot, and now, in these final cooling embers, stem length ceases to matter altogether. Snuff takes the stage. Cigars lurk on the horizon. Warehouses relegate crates of unsold pipes to corners where mice nest in bowls once polished by hopeful merchants. Ledgers, too, slip into archival hush, their barleycorn tallies growing brittle. Around the edges, only antiquarians and insomniacs leaf through them, tracing rows of numbers as if counting sheep. 1 barleycorn, 2 barleycorns, 3 until eyelids sag, quills still poised above a margin. The last recorded measurement, faded to ghost ink, simply reads, sufficient. If you are still drifting alongside, picture those discarded stems lining a gentle hillside, each fragment pointing nowhere in particular, like little compasses too lazy to find north. A breeze rattles through broken clay, producing a soft clinking similar to distant bells, or perhaps to nothing at all, once drowsiness meets the world. Let the fragments lie. Let the ledgers close. Let every barleycorn turn to chaff in the chaff in the slow mill of your thoughts until even counting becomes too great an effort, and sleep, that most reliable ordinance, extends beyond regulation or repeal. You might not imagine that the quiet expansion and contraction of a linen rectangle could shape the destinies of bakers, abbots, and half-asleep scribes, yet here we drift toward a century-long tale of medieval European tablecloth wit. If you're still awake when I reach the 1492 edict limiting banquet linens to the breadth of a modest goose's spread wings, feel entirely free to subscribe, though I doubt either of us will remember such exertion by dawn. It begins on a fog-tasting morning in Burgundy, 1473, when a mule-powered loom clucks softly behind a stone cottage. The weaver, one Jahan de Macon, has decided without fanfare to add a single extra finger's breadth to every cloth she weaves. No manifesto accompanies the choice. Her shuttle simply wanders a little farther before she sighs and ties off the warp. The resulting cloths measure perhaps a handspan wider than custom, but no guild rule yet forbids gentle curiosity. Monks from the nearby priory, eternally in search of altar coverings that refuse to curl at the edges, note the surplus width in their ledgers with faint surprise. Latitudo levator amplior sed nihil nocet. Translated loosely, it reads, wider somewhat, harm none. The phrase becomes a sort of lullaby among novices who, tasked with inventorying cloth after Compline, repeat it until the syllables dissolve into yawns. Linen piles grow. Bolts are folded twice, then thrice, then tucked into cedar chests that creak exactly like distant lullaby drums. Word of Jahan's indulgent leave wafts downriver to Dijon, where a baker named Guillaume hosts evening suppers for weary travelers. He purchases 2 of the generous linens, spreads them end to end along a trestle table, and promptly discovers an unforeseen delight. The cloths drape low enough to veil the clumsy wooden braces beneath. Patrons, spared the sight of splintered legs, feel an inexplicable uptick in appetite, leading Guillaume to record a 6-loaf surge in bread consumption over a fortnight. This statistical triumph, copied into his flour-stained ledger, reaches the ears of the city's linen workers syndicate, who assemble in yawning conference to ponder whether width might become a commercial virtue rather than an accidental. Graced by Midsummer 1476, syndicate scribes have drafted a provisional ribbon rule dictating that any tablecloth exceeding 3L and a quarter must bear a blue selvage stripe, a sleepy compromise between outright ban and gentle. Promotion. The stripes dye, sourced from woad vats behind the guild hall, splatters apprentices' shoes and dyes the courtyard pigeons of faint cerulean. Townsfolk nickname them cloth doves, and their cooing becomes the unofficial metronome of market. Days. Of course, the dye proves slightly acidic. So many blue-edged linens develop breezy pinholes after several washings, which in turn stimulates a secondary market for patchwork circles sewn over the damage. These patches resemble moon phases, drifting across feast tables, and minstrels compose half-hearted verses comparing crumbs to stars in the lunar cloth sky. Audiences smile politely, then reach for more cheese, their thoughts already slipping toward after-dinner drowse. Elsewhere, In a Cistercian laundry house near the Mews, monks debate stain management. A whiter cloth, they argue, invites greater. Spillage, and spillage invites confession. To quantify sin and perhaps to lull novices with arithmetic, they institute the drop tax. For every splash of wine whiter than a pebble, the responsible brother must embroider a thread of black, silk along the tablecloth's edge. Over seasons, certain refectory linens acquire so many penitent stitches that they appear striped, like soft nocturnal zebras grazing on candle glow. Visitors from Parma admire the quiet discipline, copy the practice, and thereby transport the notion of stain taxes across the Alps. Soon, Alpine taverns boast striped sobriety cloths, which patrons find reassuringly moral. If somewhat itchy wears silk threads bunched beneath pewter goblets, it becomes fashionable at deeply tedious banquets to count a cloth's embroidered stripes instead of engaging in conversation, a pastime as effective as counting sheep, with the added advantage of avoiding eye contact. Around 1482, two rival weaving families Lestrange and Baudin enter a polite contest in Lyon to supply the episcopal palace. Lestrange favors incremental width, 2 fingers at a time. Baudin, fearing excess, shortens cloths by precisely the thickness of a small. Himba, the palace steward, confronted with bolts from both households, cannot decide which dimension pleases Providence. To resolve the impasse, he invites local school children to lunch and measures how many crumbs fall upon each sample. The children, more interested in chasing bees than eating, scatter crumbs with democratic enthusiasm, leaving no discernible difference. The steward therefore compromises, with strange claws on Mondays and Wednesdays, Baudin on Tuesdays and Fridays, Thursdays reserved for any bolt too narrow or too wide to satisfy either faction. Sundays remain bare-board for humility. Chroniclers record the schedule in meticulous ink, unaware that centuries later, librarians will puzzle over why a table-setting rota occupies 15 pages of cathedral archives. Those librarians, incidentally, grow famously drowsy mid-catalog, crediting the soft cadence of alternating names, Lestrange, Baudin, Lestrange, as an accidental sedative. The final decade of the 15th century brings a cautious backlash. Merchants complain that widening cloths increases packing volume aboard river barges, forcing owners to pay higher tolls at each customs pier. In response, the master of tolls drafts a tariff table so labyrinthine it resembles musical notation. Performed by sleepwalkers, for every L over 3, add a penny. Subtract half a penny if the cloth features fewer than 6 black penitent stripes. Waive all fees during Lent if the weave includes a devotional emblem visible from 3 arm lengths. Bargemen, unable to decipher the schedule without elaborate finger counting, eventually ignore it altogether, trusting that port officials are equally befuddled. They are correct. Tired guards wave cargo through rather than recite the clause about devotional visibility, and the whole tariff becomes a ghost, haunting parchment but never materializing in coin. Somewhere in this haze of rules and counter-rules, our story loops back to Jehan de Meccan, now gray-plated, still weaving. When asked why she first widened her cloths, she offers a shrug so gentle it could crumple parchment. The sun was bright that morning, and the yarn felt generous. Historians later quote the remark as evidence of proto-humanist whimsy, though perhaps it was simply the observation of a woman counting warp threads until daylight blurred. Either way, her extra finger's breadth drifts forward through decades like a soft ripple in slow water, nudging laws, ledgers, tolls, and lullabies toward ever calmer eddies dot at last. On a January night in 1501, a minor council in Rouen declares width a private matter beyond civic concern. The ordinance occupies 2 lines, neither especially poetic. Let every weaver measure as conscience allows. Let every table welcome cloth sufficient to its company. Scribes copy the text with almost affectionate relief, as though released from counting barleycorns on behalf of those too sleepy to care. Warehouses continue to store both narrow and broad bolts, their labels gradually curling away from glue until no one remembers which shelf favored which size. In the hush, cloth settles atop cloth, threads relaxing like tired arms, ready to drape over any trestle that beckons Dot, so we drift to the close, where an imaginary banquet awaits in a hall no longer exact about its linens. Candles flicker low, spoons clink, and somewhere a single crumb tumbles into a fold that might be a finger broader or slimmer than yesterday's. No steward measures, no monk embroiders. The ripple of fabric rises and falls with each slow breath of the diners, then with your own, until even the notion of measurement feels excessive. Should you wake before dawn, you may find you've forgotten whether cloth was ever wider or by how much. That uncertainty is its own quiet luxury, softer than linen, lighter than dust, ready to blanket the mind in uncomplicated silence. You might not expect a marriage contract scrawled on rosewater-scented paper to contain more clauses about coffee temperature than about love itself. But here we wander, candle in hand, through an Ottoman bedroom where comfort and custom turn beneath the slow ceiling fan of time. If you're still blinking by the moment I reach the rule about acceptable walnut shell ash in the brazier, do feel free to subscribe or simply sigh and drift. The algorithm will cope without you. The door closes with a hush that feels rehearsed. In a modest stone home near Bursa, a new bride Aisha, 17 winters. No dowry, but her own embroidery. Hoop unrolls the hand-copied NECA document on the cedar chest. It lists in a sleepy procession of inkblots, rights to 3 cups of thick coffee daily, permission to visit the public bath each Thursday before dusk, and an allowance of silken thread the width of a sparrow's wing for personal sewing. Groom, Mehmet the dyer, nods politely at each clause. He is more concerned, if truth be told, with the placement of the brazier so that morning coals will not scorch the carpets. Their mothers hover, trading phrases about modesty and cinnamon. No one mentions passion aloud, yet it fiddles between the lines like a cat exploring new curtains. The imam pronounces blessings at a pace that suggests he too would like a nap. With signatures complete, the parchment is folded, tucked into a reed box, an almost instantly forgotten save for its faint perfume, which lingers like a quiet promise whenever the chest is open for linens. Outside, a neighbor plucks at a saz and murmurs verses that compare marriage to a caravan, steady, creaking, forever between wells, but rarely without shade. Inside, Aishi learns the geography of the shared bed. Quilts are layered according to season-first cotton, then wool, then a final embroidered sheet stitched with pomegranates that symbolize both fertility and excellent stain camouflage. Mehmet sleeps nearest the wall through winter, so his body. Heat can reflect off stone. In summer, they reverse, her cooler form against the masonry. Little rules like this drift from mother to daughter, father to son, as casually as recipes. A marriage, the elders say, survives on simple geometry. Who faces the breeze? Who rises first to stir the ashes? Whose foot finds the floorboards, one forgiving not during restless nights? These calculations, tiny as poppy seeds on a cimet, add up to decades. By the hearth the next afternoon, an aunt arrives with a copper spoon and teaches Aishi the science of coffee foam. 3 slow boils produce the velveteen crema esteemed in Istanbul gossip, but over-frothing is frowned upon too. Much enthusiasm in a pot, they warn, invites disquiet in bed. So the girl watches tiny bubbles form, pop, reform, until the liquid looks, in the half-light, like a starlit Bosporus. She pours the result into 2 porcelain cups painted with hyacinths, careful to present Mehmet's cup with the flower facing him. If he notices the symbolism hyacinths for constancy, he hides it behind a polite sip. Microhook, perhaps. The Ottoman palate believed foam thickness could foretell mood. A thin ring signified a mourning suited to small grievances about laundry, while a dense cap suggested either reconciliations or naps. In this house, both interpretations end in silence, so soft it cools the room. The calendar rolls toward winter, and with it comes the ceremony of sock mending. Ottoman households seldom wasted wool. Instead, they repaired socks by lamplight, counting stitches like beads of prayer. Aisha's needle slides through heel after heel, while Mehmet recites couplets from Fuzuli, each line lingering just long, enough to feel like a shared yawn. He never quite finishes a ghazal. The poem fades whenever she ties a knot, as though verse itself surrenders to the dim amber glow. Scholars later debate whether this nightly duet constituted courtship or merely housekeeping. The answer, of course, is both and neither. In married life, romance hides beneath chores like rosewater under rice, faint but unmistakable once you taste for it. Spring odors float in from the courtyard where fig trees swell. With figs come ants, and thus the annual sprinkling of powdered alum along windowsills. Ottoman guides to household management advise wives to scatter the powder after noon prayer, never before, lest the breeze carry particles into neighbors' cooking pots and spark whispered accusation of salt sabotage. Aish follows the timing faithfully. Ant lines break, reform, break again, as though they too respect the neighborhood's invisible etiquette. Curiously, the same manuals suggest that harmony in the marital bed improves when pests remain outdoors. Whether correlation or superstition, the logic pleases Mehmet. He purchases extra alum just in case desire needs a wider moat. On alternate Fridays, the couple visit the hammam separately, of course in return swaddled in towels that smell of orange blossom soap. Bathhouse attendants claim the fragrance broker's peace. Couples bathed in blossom rarely quarrel before breakfast. There is no empirical ledger for this claim, yet countless dowagers nod in agreement, and that collective nod becomes its own data set. Over time, traders import more orange essence, prices fall. Even the poorest brides might carry a faint citrus aura beneath their veils. The city, on humid nights, exudes a nationwide yawn of blossom steam, comforting as a lullaby for those drifting. Through narrow alleys toward sleep, one evening, a traveling storyteller visits their neighborhood coffeehouse shadowed, half-whispered, walls stained mahogany by centuries of smoke. He spins tales of palace intrigues, but the crowd hums loudest when he describes ordinary husbands presenting their wives with nutmeg graters as anniversary gifts. Apparently, nutmeg and milk before bed was believed to nudge dreams toward agreeable confidences. Mehmet, inspired, barters 2 skeins of dyed silk for a tiny grater carved from olive wood. Aish laughs quietly for propriety and stores it in the reed box beside the Nika parchment. Some nights they remember to shave a seed into warm milk. Others they forget, yet still dream kindly. Perhaps the placebo is enough. Perhaps the wood itself releases a sleepy scent. Either way, a new line of trade opens, and future ledgers will note a modest spike in nutmeg imports attributed to domestic tranquility. Years slide by like sand across a brass tray. Children arrive, 2 small daughters who treat the coffee cups as drums until taught otherwise. Their parents model affection not through grand gestures, but through the slow curl of rugs each dawn, the shared folding of laundry, and the uncanny ability to find one another's misplaced slippers in pre-dawn gloom. A visitor from Venice once comments that Mehmet and Aishi seem subdued, even cold. He cannot hear the unspoken rhythms beneath, the surface decency. What he misses is the Ottoman principle of Huser peaceful contentment so gentle it rarely raises its own flag. Huser lives in the pause before complaints, in the patience of waiting for the kettle to hum, in the silent handshake between partners who understand sheer domestic momentum to be its own lullaby. Toward the end, when the daughters have married, and distant minarets frame the couple's twilight, Ish still stretches each fresh cloth across the bed to check for symmetry. She no longer measures with tape. She measures by feel, trusting fingers refined by decades of quilting. Mehmet, now more beard than cheek, insists upon brewing their nightly coffee himself, believing foam tastes sweeter when prepared by work-scarred hands. Together, they sit on low cushions while the street lamp flickers. Through the window wafts the call to prayer, soft, unhurried, and just beneath it, the older call of conversation between two who need few words. If a crumb of locum drops on the quilt, H.E. smiles and leaves it for later ants that never arrive. Thanks to the alum's quiet border dot, so comes the close of another Ottoman day, indistinguishable from the thousands before it, yet utterly sufficient. Marriage here is not thunder but drizzle, small, consistent, capable of greening a hillside without anyone noting the exact moment brown became green. Should you awaken later and wonder whether anything dramatic happened, you will find only the steady drip of coffee grounds cooling in porcelain, a spoon resting against a saucer, and the faintest trace of orange blossom riding the air. It is enough. Let the spoon be your metronome, ticking slower and slower, until even history feels like housekeeping and housekeeping feels like sleep. You might be surprised to learn that a wooden door, painted the color of oversteeped tea, could once signal whether gossip was sold inside by the cup or by the hour. But here we are, strolling very slowly through an Ottoman side street where lanterns sigh more than they shine. If you're still awake by the time I describe the exact creak frequency of hinge number 7, feel entirely free to subscribe, though I promise not to hold it against you if you surrender to sleep instead. Night begins in Galetta's narrow vein of passageways, where cobbles glisten under leftover dishwater and distant Bosporus mist. A stray cat pads ahead like an unofficial tour guide, tail flicking at every scent of cardamom. Doors on the left hide legal tailors. Doors on the right hide the kind of stitching society pretends not to see. From an upstairs lattice, a woman, with henna-darkened fingertips, sprinkles rose water, ostensibly for freshness, though rumor insists she times each splash to mark which lover should knock next. Records never mention her name. They list her only as the one with the polite wrists. Even municipal inspectors, who catalogued nearly everything down to the length of tavern benches, left that detail respectfully vague, perhaps too drowsy. To sharpen their quills at midnight dot a little farther on, the street's single oil lamp flickers in sympathy with a storyteller's murmur wafting out of Kezaid Mustafa's coffee house. Inside, hookah embers glow like undecided rubies. The proprietor, Hussien, polishes porcelain cups in circles so slow one could embroider an entire prayer rug between rotations. He measures coffee with a spoon said to be forged from a janissary's fallen helmet history, brewed into every scoop, or so the marketing goes. Patrons recline on low divans, pretending interest in chess while their ears tilt toward the curtained alcove where softer commerce unfolds. Someone coughs deliberately to mask the slide of coins. Someone else coughs back, acknowledging the receipt without so much as a glance. Ottoman etiquette excels at such semaphore, whole conversations conveyed by throat clearing, sleeve tugging, or the precise depth at which a fez is tipped before sleep claims the room. Behind that velvet curtain, the air thickens with meningic, coffee pistachio-based, greener than an envious rumor. Here sit the professional listeners, women hired not for their bodies but for their ears, trained to nod at a pace that coaxes confessions from even the most stoic bureaucrat. One pasha allegedly surrendered the entire schedule of fleet departures after 3 cups, simply because the nodding rhythm reminded him of waves against a hull. Historians searching for the leak later blame foreign spies. They should have blamed the lullaby cadence of a practitioner known only as Madame Yes, Yes. She never raised her voice above a friendly drizzle and never answered a direct question, yet whole treaties drifted into her notebook like petals onto still water. She kept the notebook beneath a cushion stuffed with lavender, so even secrets rested softly. Our path bends now toward Kukik Passage, a quarter where brothels present a facade of respectability so convincing they invoice for shoe polishing as philosophical consultation. Officially, these houses operate under strict imperial regulation. Lamps must be extinguished at the call to dawn prayer. Curtains may display embroidery, but never glass beads. Too reflective, too suggestive, and musicians must limit themselves to 3 instruments lest the melody grow intoxicating. Unofficially, every rule is obeyed with just enough devotion to prove ingenuity. Musicians substitute a single tambourine with a tambourine-shaped lute, arguing it counts as one. Curtains hide beads on the inside hem where inspectors forget to look. As for dawn, well, the rooster can always be convinced to snooze if someone tosses him extra grain at midnight. There is, in short, a bureaucratic wink built into every regulation slow, unhurried and nearly imperceptible, like the moment a candle decides to gutter. We pause outside one copper-plated doorway, where a madam named Zuliha chalks price lists in fractions, then erases them before officials pass, leaving white smudges whose very vagueness becomes the new menu. Her establishment specializes in conversation flavored with forbidden poetry. A client pays by syllable, reciting lines of Bakul, while Zuliha's girls respond with counter-couplets that tease without committing. The exchange is less like flirting and more like trading stamps. Each tries to outdo the rarity of the others. Verse until everyone drifts into a stupor of metrics and metaphors. The actual climax, if you can call it that, arrives when someone remembers the final rhyme to a long-lost stanza. The room exhales, satisfied, and the candles burn down unnoticed. Back on the street, gossip scurries faster than footsteps. A baker's apprentice whispers that the Grand Vizier's nephew employs a secret tunnel to visit his favorite storyteller. A porter swears she saw the same nephew exit by a rooftop instead. Both claims cannot be true, but both will be believed until something more delicious arrives. Ottoman rumor behaves like thick molasses, slow to start, impossible to halt, and wonderfully sticky once it coats your thoughts. Scholars later lament how little concrete evidence survives from these quarters. Yet those same scholars admit their late-night research breaks, spent in modern cafes, yielded rumors remarkably similar in shape and sweetness. Some structures, it seems, never collapse. They merely change decordad as we near the Golden Horn. The damp breeze carries traces of coal, cardamom, and the faint tang of lantern oil. Here dock workers finish their shift with bowls of goza, the fermented millet drink that hums gentle warmth through tired limbs. Local superstition insists boza strengthens resolve against temptation. So naturally, the street, boasting 3 boza stalls, also boasts the highest concentration of discrete staircases, leading nowhere visible. A social historian once counted 20 such staircases in a single alley, each ending at a door painted in a different hopeful shade. The historian recorded paint codes, but not what lay behind the doors. The archive entry concludes simply, content self-explanatory upon entry. One imagines the scribe yawning as he wrote, lulled by the soft futility of cataloging what everyone already knows, and no one ever says .midnight tilts toward dawn. In the coffee house, embers settle into a geometry of crimson dots, mapping constellations for those still awake. Husain's final task is the nightly grounds reading, swirling leftover coffee in a tray, then divining future profits from how the sledge patterns resemble ships or snakes. Tonight the grounds form what looks like a sleeping cat. Hassian interprets this as a sign that guests will linger, paying for pillows rather than drinks. He leaves the tray by the window so passers-by can note the omen and adjust their expectations. Superstition or marketing, no one argues, because both serve the same purpose, to soothe uncertainty enough that dreams can tiptoe in. The call to prayer grows imminent, yet even the muezzin seems to inhale slowly, unwilling to break the hush. Brothel lamps dim one by one, as if the city pinches out stars indoors to make way for the cosmic version above. In an upper room, Zeliha slides the forbidden notebooks beneath a loose floorboard, always the second plank, never the first, and pats the wood like a bedtime storybook. Downstairs, madam, yes. Yes, extinguishes her final candle with a sigh practiced to be neither regret nor relief. Merely punctuation. Lanterns blink out across Galata until only dawn's cobalt promise seeps between rooftops. Somewhere a rooster finally remembers his purpose, grain or no grain, and croaks an off-key reveille. Coffee pots will soon rattle awake. Merchants will sweep away traces of clandestine footprints. Historians will arrive decades later, scratching their heads over contradictory ledgers. Yet in the slender margin of almost morning, secrets lie, folded like quiet napkins on empty tables, waiting for the next night's feast of murmurs. Let your eyelids imitate them folding once, twice, settling, and let the city's soft racket fade into a single sustained hum, like a far-off tambourine obeying the three-instrument rule. When you wake, the streets will have rearranged themselves into respectful daylight order, and the only proof of tonight will be the whisper of cardamom still drifting through your half-remembered dream. You might not expect a single pomegranate seed to have inspired 3 separate imperial poets to write 47 verses each, all arguing about whether the seed fell willingly from the fruit or was exiled by gravity, yet here we are, easing into an Ottoman evening where metaphor stretches itself like a drowsy cat. If you're still awake when I reach the line-by-line debate on whether dew counts as sky perspiration, feel utterly free to click subscribe, or let the thought drift away like smoke from a half-forgotten candle. A lantern glows low in the palace library, barely illuminating divan collections bound in leather softer than yesterday's bread. Court scribes sit cross-legged, copying love poems onto paper dusted with rose water so faint the words almost float. They pause often, not from fatigue, but from the slow ceremony of trimming reed pens, each slice a tiny act of suspense, as though the next letter might reveal the universe if the nib is just sharp enough. One poet likens longing to a silk sash caught on an unseen nail. Another counters that true longing is a mirror fogged by its own impatience. The head scribe yawns, diplomatically recording both metaphors with equal flourish, for in the sleepy politics of poetry, nobody truly wins. Everyone merely reclines at different angles of metaphorical despair. Outside, nightingale songs weave through cypress branches, those birds forever conscripted as understudies for frustrated lovers. Ottoman poets counted at least 13 shades of nightingale melancholy, the half-hearted trill, the resigned chirp, the dignified sob. Scholars today prefer to categorize them as bird noises, but the palace catalog insisted each shade matched a human emotion, right down to the sub-feeling of wistfulness after receiving good news too late to matter. Copyists annotated the margins with these classifications, sometimes sketching a tiny beak beside particularly mournful couplets. Somewhere in Istanbul's archives sleeps an entire folio titled Nightingale Footnotes, which critics agree is either the apex of literary devotion or a prolonged procrastination ritual. The gentle clatter of an inkstone signals the second. Drift of our night, we move to a quieter chamber where court ladies, forbidden from public recitation, share verses behind latticed screens. Their preferred metaphor is the moon, but not the obvious full moon that brazenly lights the Bosporus. They favor the thin, tentative crescent small enough to conceal secrets, bright enough to promise that someone is still listening. One lady compares forbidden affection to henna staining inside a glove, visible only to the hand that wears it. Her companion laughs softly, suggesting desire is more like sherbet cooling in a hidden courtyard tart, transient and liable to melt before anyone admits they wanted it. The conversation peters out not from lack of ideas, but because the cooling sherbet is an actual bowl, and poetic hunger soon gives way to literal spoons. Onward now, to the street of bookbinders where itinerant verse sellers chant lines for spare coins. Their cadence sways like a hammock, back and forth, never quite reaching resolution. A vendor unwraps a scroll promising 33 metaphors for the unobtainable beloved, ranked by sweetness, though customers rarely make it past metaphor 11 before eyelids flutter shut. Another hawker recites ghazals so slowly that pigeons perch on his shoulders between couplets, adding avian punctuation to rhymes about lips and wine. A passerby tips him with roasted chestnuts that he pockets absent-mindedly, later discovering poetic ink does not mingle well with chestnut oil, lesson that becomes tomorrow's metaphor for compromised purity. Our final gentle descent leads to the imperial garden, where water channels trace verses in liquid geometry. At dawn, gardeners will tilt ceramic spouts to redirect the flow, effectively editing the poem without touching a pen. Tonight the water spells out a refrain comparing, yearning to a caravan arriving one breath after the gates close. No one reads it aloud. The poem exists only for moonlight and curious moths, which swirl above like miniature editors erasing syllables with their wings. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, the muezzin will soon uncurl the first call to prayer, pulling language from dream into daylight order. But for a few more heartbeats, the city lingers in its half-lit stanza, where metaphors drowse and nightingales rehearse sorrow. Allow your thoughts to drift with them unhurried, circular, pleasantly lost. Should morning find you before the sentence ends, remember that every Ottoman poet believed the truest line was the one left unfinished, hovering on the page like smoke that forgot it was supposed to rise. Let your breathing imitate that pause. Let sleep claim the last rhyme. You might not expect a single footnote in the 15th century legal commentary to mention the correct angle for folding a marital bed cover, yet here we are, tiptoeing into the dim reading room of an Ottoman madrasa, where scholars whisper about linens as solemnly as they parse verses on inheritance. If you remain awake long enough for me to reach the debate over whether lavender sachets qualify as illicit enticement, feel free to subscribe though, truly. Do not tax yourself on my account. The jurists themselves would advise moderation. In all exertions, especially listening, the lamps are whale oil, their flames small and steady, casting oval halos onto piles of parchment that smell faintly of cloves. A gray-bearded sheik draws his finger along a line of script describing the duties of a husband at twilight. He should wash, he should perfume, he should approach with gentle speech, and yet, and here the footnote lurks, he must not remove his turban in a manner deemed immodest. 3 apprentices argue over the precise meaning of immodest. One suggests any sudden movement. Another says it concerns distance from the Qibla. The third wonders whether an audible sigh would be the greater offense. Their voices drift into the rafters where pigeons roost, approving all rulings with soft, oblivious coos. Eventually, the sheik settles the matter by quoting an earlier commentary that itself quotes a still earlier jurist who once admitted he was uncertain but inclined toward discretion. All nod, pleased by the elegance of uncertainty wrapped in certainty's robe, and the night moves on like ink seeking its next page. Not far away, in a merchant's courtyard, candles swim in shallow brass saucers beside jugs of cooling milk. The household gathers for the evening lesson delivered by a hired imam, whose specialty is delicate questions. He explains that the Sharia, like a polite guest, knocks before entering the bedroom, and once inside prefers to rearrange pillows rather than overturn the mattress. For example, silk is permitted unless dyed in a color too distracting, though no treatise agrees which hue crosses the line from tasteful to turbulent. The children giggle at this, not from mischief, merely from the strange power adults grant to die. Their mother hushes them with a smile and asks about singing. Is a lullaby allowed if it drifts, as lullabies will, into longing? The imam pauses, sips smoke, and answers that longing in a lullaby is excused by its sleepy intent. In the ledger of sins and virtues, he says, all lullabies are stamped temporarily suspended, pending awakening. Everyone finds this ruling perfectly reasonable, and perhaps you do too, unless you have already dozed off, which would be entirely within the spirit of the law. Midnight unfurls like a silk ribbon down the streets of Istanbul, and questions accumulate in discreet little boxes set outside neighborhood mosques. People slip folded notes through the slats. A baker asks whether counting loaves might distract from marital obligations. A sailor wonders if dreams of mermaids require ritual washing. An elderly widow simply writes, "Am I still obliged to remember?" The mufti will collect these at dawn, but for now the boxes sit like shy confidants beneath lattice windows. Cats rub against them, attracted to the faint scent of cedar ink. Somewhere a watchman beats his wooden clapper, marking the hour when, according to one jurist, the angels change shifts and freshly document the city's intentions. Imagine the ledger they keep. Columns for sighs, columns for hesitations, columns for pillows dared and pillows declined. Historians searching archives centuries later will never find these ledgers, yet they will quote them anyway, because loss is the most authoritative source of all. A breeze stirs the curtains of the Sultan's private library just before dawn, carrying hints of sea salt and distant bread ovens. Inside, the palace librarian dozes over a manuscript titled Methods of Mutual Courtesy. Its final chapter, a serene discourse on silence shared between spouses after the candle is snuffed. The text claims that silence, handled properly, is as expressive as poetry. It must be wrapped around the couple like a veil, neither too tight nor too loose. The librarian dreams that he is cataloging varieties of hush, the anticipatory hush, the reflective hush, the hush that falls when both partners realize they have forgotten which side of the bed is theirs. At the call to prayer, he wakes with the imprint of a marginal note on his cheek. Some authorities permit laughter if muffled by bedding. He wonders whether his own sleepy breathing counted as laughter. The uncertainty soothes him, and he closes the book with a sigh gentle enough to qualify as lawful. Outside, minarets bloom with low chanting, and the city stirs. The sheik at the madrasa extinguishes his lamp, satisfied that the angle of turban removal may remain immortally vague. The merchant's household slips into dawn chores, recalling only fragments of the imam's distinctions between dyes and desires. The mufti unlocks a box of folded questions, not yet aware that one note contains only a pressed jasmine petal. No query, just fragrance. And you, drifting somewhere between footnote and feather, may find your eyelids heavier than any legal commentary. Let them close as softly as a page no longer turned. In the hush that follows, remember that Ottoman jurists believed even dreams carried etiquette, so treat your own with quiet courtesy. Welcome sleep like a lawful guest, and allow the night's last ink to dry untouched. You might not imagine that a single cracked tile in an imperial bathhouse could dictate whether a whisper counted as a sin. Yet here we are, easing into a twilight corner of Ottoman life, where zealous scribes measured decorum in bruteless fragments, and censors of Rosewater sighed at every infraction. If you are still awake by the time we reach the proper diameter of a punishment cane, feel free to subscribe or drift away, which the judges of old would regard as a perfectly harmless escape. first stir of concern often arrived not with an act, but with a rumor, seeping through latticed windows like smoke that insists it is only mist. An elderly coffee vendor might mention, very softly, that a neighbor's daughter had been seen humming a love lament of questionable cadence. No decree ever specified which cadence tipped music into impropriety, yet the city's moral wardens kept a ledger anyway, writing cautious phrases like excessive yearning in the upper register. These men, known as the Mutasib's listeners, patrolled bazaars at dawn when shutters clacked and cats negotiated the rights to fish bones. To be cited for yearning in the upper register did not warrant flogging, only a visit from a scholar, who would, in unhurried tones, advise the family to limit musical intervals to modest thirds. One cannot help picturing an entire household adjusting its size to fit a scale polite enough for heaven. A kind of invisible metronome ticking behind every door. More explicit taboos drew sterner attention, and for them, the records grow denser. Like winter manuscripts swollen with pomegranate juice used as cheap red ink. A cloth dyer from Uskadar confessed under gentle pressure that he had turned his workshop into a clandestine trysting room after sunset. The court protocol required 3 unrelated witnesses before a penalty could be imposed, yet sympathetic. Neighbors bribed the witnesses with bolts of color-fast indigo, a hue reputed to calm both eye and conscience. The judge shrugged and ordered the dyer's door sealed with wax until he could recite by heart 100 lines of devotional poetry. It took him 9 evenings. Afterwards, he claimed the verses improved his mordanting process. Local weavers agreed there. Fabrics held pigment longer than ever, proving that moral correction sometimes produced surprisingly durable blues. Physical punishments, though often threatened, were applied with theatrical caution. The regulation cane was to be cut from a pomegranate branch, no thicker than a scribe's quill, lest zeal overtake mercy. One chronicler records a debate over whether knots in the wood rendered the blows ritually invalid. A conservative panel ruled that knots, symbolizing disorder, had to be trimmed away, thereby reducing the cane's weight to something scarcely heavier than a child's pointer. The same scroll notes that during a public chastisement, the audience frequently nodded in drowsy solidarity, some even dozing between strokes for the rhythm of reprimand, slow and counted, lulled them like distant drums. Such scenes suggest that punishment in the empire could become almost soporific, a civic lullaby reminding onlookers to mind their desires, while simultaneously nudging them toward an afternoon nap. Yet the weightiest deterrent was not the cane, but social vapor, a chill that settled around offenders long after any formal sentence. Imagine a young groom discovered in possession of an erotic manuscript smuggled from Cairo. The court confiscated the booklet, but the sharper sting was invisible. Merchants began wrapping his purchases a little too tightly. Tailors fitted his jackets with faint impatience, and even street dogs avoided his doorway, as if gossip clung to his threshold with a scent beyond canine tolerance. After weeks of solitude, he surrendered the offending title to the palace library, where it joined an entire shelf of prohibited texts, carefully guarded by librarians who read them anyway solely to index each indecency for future control. Or, so they assured the Sultan. Every ban inspired an equal and opposite ingenuity. In the silk weaver's quarter, lovers developed a code of ribbons tied to balcony rails, crimson for longing, saffron for apology, undyed for secrecy accepted. The Mutasib eventually caught on and outlawed balcony ribbons altogether, prompting lovers to switch to knots in the laundry line. When knots were forbidden, they discovered subtle variations in how a bedsheet was folded. Valley first for yes, mountain first for no, hospital corner for meet at the spice gate after moonrise. Punishments chased these signals like a sleepy cat after a nimble mouse. never quite catching the latest silhouette of desire before it slipped through another crack in the lattice dot. Meanwhile, storytellers at night markets wove cautionary tales, designed to frighten listeners onto virtuous paths, but their yarns proved so enchanting that crowds leaned closer with every forbidden's flourish. One popular tale concerned a jewel thief who disguised himself as a eunuch to enter the palace harem, only to be caught when he blushed at the sight of a polishing mirror. The assigned penalty? A lifetime of polishing mirrors in the dungeons, doomed to behold his own crimson cheeks forever. Audience members sighed at the poetic justice, then hurried home to polish their own small mirrors, just in case reflection might reveal illicit warmth. Thus, moral instruction drifted into domestic routine, and households gleamed quite helplessly. Occasionally, mercy wore the guise of bureaucracy. Records mention a cobbler fined for telling an off-color joke within earshot of a mosque doorway. Because the scribe miswrote his name, the fine was billed to a citrus importer of similar designation, who contested it by citing a hadith on the virtues of laughter. The judge postponed deliberation until an expert on comedic jurisprudence could be summoned from Bursa. Months passed, the docket filled. The joke itself was forgotten. When the expert finally arrived, city officials treated him to sherbet so chilled it numbed every tongue in the hall, ensuring no one dared speak another questionable jest. By then the cobbler had mended dozens of pilgrim's sandals in remorseful silence, while the citrus importer, whose oranges fermented unsold, shifted to pomegranate trade, which prospered. If there was a moral, it dissolved into the sherbet along with everyone's memory of the original punchline. As dawn lifts its pale shoulder over the Bosporus, the night's ledgers close. Punishments, taboos, silent censures all settle like fine dust upon shelves already thick with yesteryear's anxieties. Somewhere a dyer thanks the prophets for verses that deepen blue. A groom breathes easier now that stray dogs pass his stoop without hesitation. And a storyteller unpacks fresh metaphors, sure to terrify and delight in equal measure. And you, hovering on the threshold of sleep, may sense that every rule contained its own lullaby, every caution its own cradle. Let your mind fold itself valley first or mountain first, whichever beckons softer dreams, and trust that even the strictest chronicler eventually dipped his quill in ink warm enough to blur the line between commandment and comfort. You may be surprised to learn that a single brass lantern, its wick trimmed too short once, forced an imperial courtier to contemplate every kiss he never dared give. If you manage to stay awake long enough for me to reach the part about soot, patterns, and secret regrets, feel free to subscribe. Though slipping softly into sleep is, of course, perfectly acceptable etiquette in this dim corner of history, in the final hour of an Ottoman night. The palace lamps surrendered one by one, each globe of glass dimming like an eyelid too heavy to argue with dreams. Servants moved in slow rotation, snuffing wicks with silver tweezers designed to make even extinguishing look ceremonial. They claimed the ritual prevented chimney fires, yet the true aim was subtler. Darkness arrived gradually enough that lovers, schemers, and solitary poets could arrange their hearts before shadows hid them from themselves. Records note that the chief lamplighter, an official post, mind you, was required to pace his rounds to match the recitation of Surat al-Falaq. Anyone inclined to mischief, therefore, had exactly 5 verses to decide whether desire outweighed discretion. Most chose discretion, though palace walls nevertheless hummed with silence possibilities, like a lute string plucked, then damped before the note could bloom. Far from the palace, in homes whose latticed windows faced alleyways slick with cool tar, ordinary families also rehearsed their nightly farewell to light. A grandmother would coil a cotton wig, set it afloat on olive oil, and speak a proverb about tongues that talk too loudly after dusk. Her grandchildren pretended not to understand, yet they mimicked her care exactly. because the empire's etiquette instructed that how one ended a flame foretold how one's secrets would fare in the afterlife. In court depositions, you can still read complaints about neighbors whose lamps sputtered instead of sighing, an offense thought to jolt the angels into jotting down one's name under unsettled souls. It is difficult not to smile at the idea of celestial clerks startled by a faulty wig, but the Ottomans believed paperwork to be universal, extending from earthly courts to ethereal registries. Sleep, then, became a sort of nightly audit. Ensure your flame fades gracefully, and heaven's bureaucrats will stamp your dossier at peace before filing it in clouds of lavender. Somewhere along the Golden Horn, bargemen secured their loads and lit a final pipe. Hookah coals glowed like miniature citadels, each a smoldering reminder that warmth persists after embers fall apart. Sailors swapped rumors of a brothel that allegedly served rose sherbet mixed with pulverized pearls, a concoction said to grant the drinker thrilling dreams. No tax ledger corroborates the existence of pearl sherbet. Still, the rumor alone was potent enough to draw sleepless apprentices toward that quarter, only for them to find an ordinary tea house instead, where the proprietor sold watery hibiscus and advice about patience in equal measure. One could argue that the empire's truest control over desire lay not in punishments, but in these gentle detours, provide an avenue just dull enough that yearning tires itself out, leaving only a faint blush of longing to sweeten tomorrows. Routine. Back in the palace, the harem halls breathed the hush of women who had already prayed, bathed, and braided each other's hair in silver-lit silence. A concubine might pause over a small window, listening to the muffled murmur of distant oars. She knew, because gossip travels faster than any skiff, that the Sultan spent the evening discussing fortress budgets rather than love. Such knowledge could have bred disappointment, yet she regarded it as a lullaby. With the ruler's attention fixed on stone bastions, her own soft ambitions could drift unhindered, like perfume escaping an uncorked vial. Court diaries tell us. She later composed a verse about guarding the heart, the way night guards a tulip, which scribes found too mild to archive in the erotic folder, yet too tender to discard. So it languished in a cabinet until archivists centuries later discovered it, smudged by the thumb of some long-dead clerk who possibly read it once, sighed, and realized he had forgotten to lower a lantern dot by custom, the very last light to be. Quenched in any given neighborhood was the street watchman's torch. He swung it in a slow arc, announcing the hour and the temperature of the breeze information somehow crucial to souls, deciding whether to dream of warm beaches or cold starlit. Terraces. A night register from 1732 lists one watchman who added unsolicited poetry to his announcements, rhyming moon with soon, so often that residents petitioned for either better metaphors or thicker shutters. The petition spent 3 months. In review, by which time the watchman had spontaneously adopted more varied couplets, apparently satisfied with his own reforms. This trivial episode reveals how softly the empire preferred to steer its citizens. File a complaint, wait for the offender's conscience to tidy itself, then close the case with no ink spilled on punishments, and would have love itself after the lanterns died. Historians searching for scandal often forget the quieter truth that most nights concluded not in forbidden tapestries of flesh, but in the simple proximity of breathing bodies. Husbands and wives having negotiated quilts against. Spring Cho shared murmured jokes about green almonds, or the muezzin who always sang one note too low. Even illicit pairs, if they managed to find a moment alone, spent half their tryst discussing the price of saffron or whether the new public fountain resembled a lion or a camel. Passion was real, yes, but it flowed beneath a steady surface of household minutiae like groundwater nourishing gardens without ever troubling the road above. One travel writer from Venice complained that Ottoman couples laughed too much for his exotic expectations. He had come to witness silk-draped hedonism. He wrung giggles over mismatched socks. He left disappointed, unaware that these mild drowsy giggles were exactly what kept desire alive long after more flamboyant cultures burned out. Toward dawn, the call to prayer rose, threading through gull cries and clop of milk carts. This first azan fractured the night's secrecy, and in doing so absolved it. What remained hidden was declared, by custom, forgiven. Gardeners swept the courtyards, erasing footprints only cats could have made, and eunuchs counted hairpins, too. Be sure none slipped into politically inconvenient pockets. The chief lamplighter walked the palace one more time, touching glass globes still warm from their former glow. He would submit a report, how many wicks needed trimming, how much oil had been spared, which lamps smoked and should be reblown. He never mentioned the concubine's poem or the secret sighs of archivists. Such things were beyond his jurisdiction. Yet, in a marginal note, he sometimes added a single phrase. All quiet, a verdict as gentle as a quilt drawn over a dozing. Empire dot, so the last lantern goes out, and with it the official record of desire, control, and those delicate negotiations staged between heartbeat and decree. Imagine your own breath now joining that hush, each exhale a miniature snuffed flame, each inhale the cool corridor awaiting dawn. The Empire's scribes have closed their ledgers for the night. The celestial clerks have stamped your dossier with a perfumed seal of peace, and even the street watchman has found a couplet that finally lets him rest his voice. Let your thoughts wander among folded sheets and muted ribbons. Should they brush against a forbidden's cadence or a tassel of longing, remember, knots can always be smoothed by morning, and every shadow that worries you now will dissolve into harmless daylight soon enough. Allow the empire to dim within you, as steady and inevitable as an olive oil lamp reaching the end of its wick. In that gentle darkness, no punishment awaits, only the soft echo of forgotten nights, and a peace tender enough to cradle your sleep,